Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Paul Musgrave. I have the honor and privilege to be sitting here with Dr. Jerome Jaffe. It's July 29th. We are in Columbia, Maryland at Dr. Jaffe's house. Thank you for agreeing to participate in the Richard Nixon Oral History Program.
My pleasure.
Let's go ahead and get started. When do you first become interested in the problems of addiction?
I suppose when I was sent to Lexington, Kentucky as a resident in psychiatry. And that was 1959. You had to get interested because that was, at the time, the major center for both research on addiction and the treatment of addiction.
And you come over in the clinical side, right?
I was sent there as a resident. Yes, this was we rotated through the clinical service of the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital.
For people who may not know, can you explain us a little bit what the Public Health Service is?
Well, the Public Health Service was set up somewhere in the beginning of the 19th century. It was originally to take care of American seamen, and then it evolved. It continues. It's a uniformed service, although it's not part of the armed forces, except in wartime, and then they serve with the Coast Guard. So it provides medical services to the Coast Guard. It also staffs. There are people in the Public Health Service who serve in the Indian Health Service. There was, until maybe 20 years ago, a series of Public Health Service hospitals that took care of certain beneficiaries of the federal government as well as American seamen. And then there's the Coast Guard, and there's the U.S. Prison Service that used to have Public Health Service officers serving as medical officers.
And of course, the head of the Public Health Service is the Surgeon General.
The Surgeon General, correct.
Lexington, Kentucky, 1959. What are the major issues, the major topics that are being discussed as you guys are on the forefront of addiction research?
Well, I wasn't on the forefront of addiction research, although the Addiction Research Center, which was co-located at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, was at the forefront of research at that time. The hospital was a separately administered entity that was taking care of approximately 1,200 drug addicts, mostly heroin addicts, but a few others who were addicted to other substances. And some were volunteers, others were actually federal prisoners. So it was a kind of a hybrid. It was a hospital prison.
When do you move to Illinois?
Oh, that was sometime later. It was the end of 1966, in December of 1966. But I had been consulting in Illinois for approximately 6 or 7 months prior to that time.
And this is kind of a new departure when you start in Illinois with the treatment program.
Well, it was not really a new departure. After the Public Health Service Hospital, I went to Albert Einstein College of Medicine to complete my psychiatric training, but also to do some postdoctoral training in pharmacology. And during that period of time, I did some research in pharmacology on the biological basis of physical dependence. And I also got involved with treating addicts because the people from Lexington somehow found out where I was and asked me to help them in various ways. So I'd already done some treatment with narcotic antagonists. I had done some work with opiate maintenance, methadone maintenance. I had visited some therapeutic communities. So I had some experience with treatment and was interested in looking at which kinds of treatment worked best for which kinds of people. For a variety of reasons that couldn't be done at Albert Einstein. And I was offered a position in Illinois by Dr. Daniel X. Friedman, who was going to be the new chairperson at the University of Chicago Department of Psychiatry. And he was asked to consult with the Illinois, I think it was called the Drug Advisory Council, that was thinking of how they could respond to the addiction problem in Illinois. And since he was busy with other things, I was sort of his surrogate. And I offered them a variety of ideas. But I told them very candidly there was just no way they could pick one of a variety of different treatments and assume that that would be the right one. That the only sensible thing was to actually set several of them up and compare them and see which one was best suited for the people in Illinois. Their response to that was to produce a report, obtain an appropriation from the Illinois legislature, but then set some conditions. They said that they would only implement it if I would agree to run it. I had a career development award that was going to support my research at the University of Chicago, but I just felt by that time I had met enough people who needed treatment that I felt that if they were the conditions, I'd just have to accept them and begin to set up a treatment system in Illinois. So that sort of ended my laboratory research, and I became maybe a hybrid myself. I was concurrently a University of Chicago faculty member, but I was also the head of the Illinois drug abuse programs. And we began, with the help of the university, to build a variety of treatment programs in Illinois. At the time that the Illinois Advisory Council set this up, there was virtually no treatment at all for drug addicts in Illinois. And so that began sometime, the planning stage was late 1967, and the implementation was January the 1st, 1968. We subsequently got some support from the National Institute of Mental Health. There's a community health grant. And so we had 2 pockets of money and began to build this treatment system.
I want to ask you a couple of follow-up questions about this. The first is that I assume politicians, folks in government generally, always want to hear that there's a silver bullet. And so when you tell them that they are going to have to try several different things, what was their reaction?
I don't know what they were thinking, but eventually maybe they found it refreshing that somebody said there is no silver bullet, that different people may need different kinds of approaches. Now, there were objections to using something like methadone, which at that time was still quite investigational, if you will. There were difficulties in setting up therapeutic communities. Nobody had ever heard of narcotic antagonists. People knew about detoxification programs. But at any rate, I think, generally speaking, they realized that what I was saying seemed to make sense.
Well, can you talk a little bit about narcotic antagonists and how they work, what their function is?
Well, narcotic antagonists are drugs that essentially get on the same receptor as drugs like morphine and methadone, but they block the effect. At that time, they were thought to produce no effects on their own, but simply block that receptor so you couldn't get high from an opiate like morphine, nor could you die of an overdose from a drug like morphine. Now, the first antagonist, partial antagonist that was used was a drug called nalorphine, and that had been studied at Lexington as early as 1954. But somewhere in 1964 or so, Bill Martin at Lexington, at the research division at Lexington, worked with a drug called cyclazazine. It was a longer-acting, orally effective narcotic antagonist, and he and Abe Wickler, who was a very noted, a giant of a researcher, talked about the use of antagonists in treatment because they thought if people were maintained on antagonists and could not get high or get the effects of opiates, eventually they would, if you will, extinguish the habit of injecting. Back in those days, this was 1965, I think, just after Bill Martin had talked about it, it was possible to get an investigatory new drug application approved without a lot of paperwork. And I was able to do an experiment with narcotic antagonists while I was still at Albert Einstein. And the remarkable thing was that although a lot of people thought that methadone was the only pharmacological treatment that you could use, there were lots of drug addicts who simply wanted to be free of being addicted, who volunteered to take cyclazazine, which was not a perfect antagonist. If you took too much too early, it had side effects, made you feel a little weird. But people persisted, people took it. So it didn't prove that it was as effective as methadone, but it did say that people who most people thought only wanted to get high would take something that didn't get them high and would only block the effects of opiates because they wanted to change their lives. And so I was impressed with the idea that people were motivated to do some things. And so the story on cyclazazine was that we worked with that until, I guess, about early 1970 when Martin again had developed or worked with a new pharmacological compound called naltrexone. And naltrexone was another antagonist, did the same thing, it got on the receptor. But it did not have, unpleasant side effects, almost neutral. And it was long enough acting so you could take it once a day and it would work. And I subsequently had an opportunity when I was at the White House to accelerate the development of naltrexone. And that turned out to be an interesting story because although, it didn't seem to be particularly useful for opiate addicts, it has become a major treatment for alcoholism.
Well, we'll talk about that when we get to the White House. I wanted to ask you you had an observation that you felt at this point that it was important for you to help treat. You'd met a lot of addicts, that it was important to you.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, people's image of the drug addict, did not necessarily coincide with the people I met. Many of them that I met had jobs, they worked. They spent a lot of their money on illicit drugs, but they were otherwise people that I would trust and that were, I guess you might say, I liked them. And when I got to Chicago, I met people desperate for treatment. And even before we set up the Illinois drug abuse programs, as I said, I'd been consulting since mid-1966. I met various people, spoke to them. I even arranged for some of them to go get some training at a therapeutic community in New York so that we might have a cadre of local people who could form the nucleus of a therapeutic community or get involved in treatment. But most of it came later, subsequently, as people got better. And from the beginning, people in recovery, I don't know whether everybody would say they were in recovery, but they were certainly doing well, not using illicit drugs, were part of the treatment program. We made arrangements to hire some of them as counselors, and at certain points they became supervisors as well and took various jobs in the Illinois drug abuse program.
Did you talk to people outside of the clinic? Were people receptive to the idea that heroin addicts were not street thugs or lowlifes or whatever the stereotype was at that point?
I think some were. Some, I think, were still skeptical. But the great community that I dealt with were the families of the drug users who were, more than pleased that people were in recovery and doing well, and families were back together and no longer disrupted by the running and all the activities associated with buying illicit drugs. So, I had lots of people. It was an odd kind of relationship, not really one of psychiatrist to individual patient, because I was the director of the program. And there were good friendships, close friendships. Periodically, we would have everybody in the program would come to a party at my house, and we made no distinction between the psychiatrists and the other faculty members who were working with me and the drug addicts who were working as messengers and other things in the program.
In the summer of 1970, you get a phone call from Jeffrey Donfeld in the White House.
Yeah.
What does he ask you to do?
Well, I'm not sure what he asked me to do first. There was he may have come to visit the program first, and then subsequently called me, or I think that might have been the case. He may have visited me and then called me, asked me to comment on some proposals by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and the FDA to restrict the availability of methadone. And apparently there was some blowback from the expansion of methadone, and it was not that great. I mean, there was New York and a few other places. Nevertheless, they wanted to sort of clamp it down, and they proposed regulations that would largely limit its size, restrict who could get it and for how long, and he asked me to write some comments. And I recall, I think I wrote a 9-page, single-spaced letter to him on that issue. And subsequent to that, he visited the program, and then the next time I heard from him, I think, was sometime in October of 1970. And he asked me if I would form a committee and write a report for the White House or the President. I don't know how he expressed it, but this would be a report on what we should do about the drug problem. And I was instructed that I should put together a committee of experts, and then he began to put qualifications on it. It had to be done in something like 8 weeks, and it had to be absolutely secret. Everybody had to swear to secrecy. It could not be published. They could not talk about it, and they would not be paid very much either. And this was, I think, unrealistic because the people that you put together are working at other jobs. They don't necessarily drop everything. So it would have meant meeting on weekends and then going through mounds of information. For whatever reason, probably a mistake, but I agreed to do that, to put this group together, and I managed to get a remarkable group of people to agree to these somewhat odd conditions. They were professors in various areas. There were pharmacologists and psychiatrists and sociologists, people of great distinction. And we put together such a report. I recruited a man named Ed Brecker as a writer. Ed subsequently wrote something called Licit and Illicit Drugs for Consumer Reports, a very widely read book. And we put together a report. It was not a work of great literary merit, but we got it done. We got an extension from Jeff to an extra 2 weeks, so we turned it in mid-December. And one of the reasons we got the extension was because he kept calling up and saying, well, what about this, what about that? How do you answer this, how do you answer that? So there's lots of little appendices, most of which had to do with, methadone. And, I figured out that somewhere in the bureaucracy in Washington, people were raising various objections to utilizing methadone as a treatment. And he wanted in our report that we would respond to each of those. So the report looks a little lopsided, but that was the context for it. The report was also colored in a major way by something I had done just that December before Jeff called me. Somewhere in the summer of 1970, I was asked by Dale Cameron, who was then working with the World Health Organization. They had something called an expert committee on problems of drug dependence. And Dale asked me to join with Professor Griffith Edwards from the Institute of Psychiatry in London and draft a white paper, which is a working draft for a report on national strategies. And so, and I don't know why Dale suggested me or why Griffith or how that came about, but Griffith was interested in the idea of a national response, some coordinated, thought-through plan to deal with a problem. And so I worked with Griffith, I believe, at his house for several weeks. We put together a report about national strategies. And so the beginning of the report for the White House, paraphrases, well, maybe that is a euphemism. In part, maybe we plagiarized ourselves, using some of the phrases about the importance of having a national coordinated strategy to deal with a problem. And so that was what we thought was important, to get all the pieces together. Law enforcement, treatment, prevention, all of these pieces talking, thought through, and how they interact. In addition, Jeff asked us to say, if you had X dollars, I think he was talking about $50 million, how would you spend it? And so we laid out how, maybe it was $100 million, don't remember at the point. How would you allocate that? And we talked about the importance of research, the importance of having outcomes. You have to measure whether you're getting what you thought you were going to get. So you have to specify your goals, and how you will measure those. So we talked about the need for research, the need for outcomes research, looking at, are you changing what you want to change? And then you needed to have treatment, because there was clear there was a huge treatment gap all over the country at that time. I guess this was the end of 1970. There were people waiting to get into treatment. Not just in methadone, although the lines were longest at methadone programs, but even to therapeutic communities. We were apparently in the midst of a major epidemic, and people wanted out, they wanted treatment, and the treatment wasn't there. So we turned in the report, and I got a note from the president saying thank you sometime in January, and I heard nothing more. And that's the Donfeld story. And that was, I heard nothing more until somewhere in terms of April. And in April, I think he asked me to come to Washington again. And we talked about something that had not even been on the horizon in any way when we wrote this report, just and turned it in December of that year. And that was heroin use in Vietnam. And, again, he said, well, what can we do? What should we do about this? And I said, well, give me some time to think about it. And he said, well, you can think about it. You can't ask anybody about it. You can't say anything about it. You can't. And this is one of these sort of strange requests of, what would you do if the only resources you had were inside your own head, if you have to keep it secret? And so, I said, well, the first thing I would try to do is to try to find out what the real numbers are. So you have to essentially decide which of these people that, are using heroin, are addicted, which are just users, how much of it is hyperbole generated by the press.
And the numbers being thrown around at this point are
Well,
10, 15, 20%.
The numbers, he said he had gotten a heads up from two congressmen, Congressman Steele and Murphy. I think that was a courtesy that no longer occurs nowadays, that congressmen would give the White House a heads up about a report coming out. That they thought it was, they said, something to 15 to 20% of the troops. And this was kind of frightening. At the time, the policy was to withdraw 1,000 people a day. So if the numbers are as high as 30%, that's 300 heroin addicts addicted who were just being flown back and released that day into the population. And so there were a lot of things that went into what I suggested, but some of it was pure happenstance. The previous January, I had been to a scientific meeting, shared an airplane ride with Professor Avram Goldstein of Stanford, and he told me about a new technology for detecting drugs in urine that could detect the presence of opiates within a minute. And this new technology required only a few drops of urine. And this was a major technological breakthrough because other than that, you'd have to have a thin layer chromatography or gas chromatography. Difficult technologies required a lot more training of technicians, much slower, much more labor intensive. So what I suggested that we could do was we would test everybody, and before they were discharged, before they came back to the United States, and those who were positive would be invited to stay a little longer for detoxification. Now, the reason I felt that the detoxification should take place in Vietnam was because some theories that Abe Wickler had suggested, I mentioned Abe in connection with the antagonists. It was his theory that withdrawal symptoms became linked by learning, conditioned to environmental stimuli, so that if you were withdrawn, let's say in your home environment, that those environmental cues would call forth craving for drugs. So I assumed that if there's anything to this theory, we better get the withdrawal over with in Vietnam because they're unlikely to encounter those cues again when they return.
So if they go through withdrawal in one environment and then you can move them to a new environment, you won't have less possibility of relapse.
That was the theory. But, without being able to discuss it with anybody, you could only go on theory. So I said, this will give us epidemiology, this will give you some deterrence, it will give you a chance to treat those who need treatment. And, of course, there's only one flaw, that under the current circumstances, using opiates was a court-martial offense. And people would get either a bad conduct discharge or a dishonorable discharge. And I suggested that, obviously, if you're going to do this, it's a public health issue. You're detecting a disorder, a medical disorder, and you have to change the regulatory situation, the code of military justice, so that you can do this. It's like taking an X-ray. If you find somebody with a lung disease, you don't give them a bad conduct discharge. I mentioned that. And so this was, I said, I guess that's what I would do. And apparently they discussed this, and as far as I know, they probably came up with other ideas, or other people said some things. But, as harebrained as it was, nobody had a better idea. And so I got another call. I believe it was on just about Memorial Day, because I remember I was supposed to give a lecture, and I had to call a friend, Ed Wolfson, and I had to give him my slides. We met in Princeton. He lived in New York, so we met in Princeton. I gave him my slides that you have to give the lecture, I have to do something else. which of course I could not reveal. And I went to Washington. And I was just prepared to talk to Jeff again. But I think at that time I met John Ehrlichman, and I guess I met Bud Krogh. And then they said, again, without any great notice, we're going to visit the Pentagon. I assumed that the purpose of the visit was to discuss this plan with them. But as it turned out, it was more than just a couple of people at the Pentagon. It was a whole room full of generals. There were a couple of colonels standing around the wall, but mostly they were generals and the Secretary of the Army. And I don't know exactly how the context was set up, but there was just Jeff and I sitting there. And I guess Jeff introduced me as a consultant to the president and said, we're going to talk about this plan. And I told them what I thought should be done. And they said, well, can't be done. But we were thinking of doing it in September. And, I was just there. I was the head of the Illinois drug abuse program. Now, I will say one thing. When Jeff called me to come in, I thought that maybe he was going to implement this plan. Not that it would come about in that way, but that maybe they would do something. So I called, wearing my Illinois drug abuse director hat, I called the man who made the frat machines. These are the machines made in California that can detect the opiates in 1 minute. And I already had one on order from my program in Illinois. It was to be the first prototype actively being used. They were expensive machines, and there were not many people who were ready to buy them. And I asked him whether he could make another one and how long it would take. And a few weeks, a month or two. I said, well, what about if you put people on 24 hours a day? And he allowed us, maybe we could make it a little faster. And I said, well, I can't exactly tell you why, but, if you do that, I don't think you'll be sorry. I suppose he did that. His name was Bill McGlashan, and he was the vice president for Cyva Corporation. And so when I was sitting there in the Pentagon, I knew that we had these two machines. And then when they said, well, maybe we can do it sometime in September, maybe. And I was going through my mind that 1,000 people were leaving a day. This was the 30th of May, as I recall. And I felt I was sharing them candidly. I said, look, gentlemen, actually what I said was, I can't believe the mightiest army on earth can't get its troops to piss in a bottle. I think that might have been the phrase that got their attention, because it seemed to deviate from protocol, given the generals and things like this. And I said, look, I know you're busy fighting a war, but if you get me a telephone, I'll get some civilians, and I think we can get it up a little sooner, because the president wants it sooner than that. And Jeff, to this day, thinks that I had a plan to sort of, ambush the military. I didn't have a plan. I was very serious. I thought maybe, we could get some guys who weren't busy fighting the war and we would set this thing up. But they took it as a threat coming directly from Richard Nixon. And they called a recess to the meeting. They went in the other room. And they came back and they said, we can do it. We'll have it up and running by June the 17th. And I said, that sounds very reasonable. And that was the end of the meeting at the Pentagon. Things went on at the White House subsequently, but I think that the recognition that the drug problem was not limited to the civilian population. but would involve the military and would involve the Veterans Administration, essentially generated the idea that what we needed was some coordinating mechanism at the White House to make all these people work together. And that probably was the origin of what came to be called the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention. But the thought of doing this, I think, came from Jeff and Bud Krogh, and how to do this, with some help from the people at OMB. And so all of that was going on behind the scenes subsequent to that meeting at the Pentagon.
I have a couple of follow-ups. The first is, by this point, when you have the Night of the Generals, have you met President Nixon?
I think I did. I think after I spoke to John Ehrlichman, I might have met with him. Yes, I'm sure I might have met with him. And it was... now, one should remember when one meets with the President of the United States. But, I was, frankly, busy running back and forth between Chicago and the other things. I don't remember whether I met him prior to going over to the Pentagon. I might have. I know I met with John Ehrlichman because the plan was run by John Ehrlichman. But I'm certain I might have met him sooner than that. It's an embarrassment, but I don't know the first time I met him. I don't recall exactly what day it was. It was certainly before June the 17th.
Right. Well, I'm just asking because you, here and other places, you felt confident to say, the president wants this, which is kind of a magic phrase, especially if you're a consultant to the president.
Well, I knew that Bud and Jeff spoke for the president and that this was an urgent issue and that they needed to do something about this. Perhaps I had met them.
You take a trip. Bud Krogh does an inspection tour of Southeast Asia. You
Yes.
meet with him in South Vietnam.
No, that was later.
That was later.
Oh, yes. A number of things took place between that meeting at the Pentagon and June the 17th. As I said, the subsequent events had to do with things that went on with the president meeting with various people on this issue, including, I guess, the Joint Chiefs of Staff around this issue, things of this sort. I'm not sure the exact dates, but this plan for the Special Action Office was developed. Slides were made of all of its responsibilities for coordinating research and prevention and treatment and education. A long list of things that one had to do, including producing the first national strategy, a variety of things. At any rate, I got called back somewhere around June the 16th. And again, without much preparation, I didn't think I was staying overnight even, as I recall. And they told me I would stay overnight, so somebody had to buy me another shirt. And then I had a meeting in the cabinet room. Again, it was a strange experience because nobody told me what I was supposed to do, but they sat me in the corner, and the president brought in members of Congress and told them he was going to launch this major initiative on drug abuse. And he pointed to me and he said, and Dr. Jaffe is going to run it. And, one doesn't say no, Mr. President. I have other things to do. But that was the first time I knew that was going to happen. And lots of people were angry with me, including the University of Chicago, that should have, they thought I should tell them about this plan. My wife, who didn't know that we were do this at any rate. And then I think on the same day we had a press conference. And I was asked to say what the plan was. But I had no idea what the plan was.
Did anyone accuse you of having a secret plan?
They could tell I had no plan. But it was clear that, the one major task, it seemed to me, was one I tried to put together. I said we want to have, it was the clear, in addition to what we were going to do with the Vietnam situation, is this treatment gap of lots and lots of people wanting treatment, couldn't get it, and crime associated with the fact that the drug is illicit and costly. And I said, we want to make treatment so available that nobody can say they committed a crime because they couldn't get treatment. We thought that would clear up some of the ambivalence that the judges had and other people had about whether somebody, but for their drug addiction, would have been a decent citizen or whether they were just a criminal who was using drugs. So that was the goal. And that was the goal we pursued, to expand treatment so that people could get treatment rather than committing crimes. Obviously, what we did was far broader and more diverse than that. But that was a centerpiece of what we intended to do. And immediately thereafter, the president told me I was going to make an inspection tour of Vietnam. Another small surprise. But I had, at that point, the Special Action Office had one employee. I wasn't even on the government payroll at that time, but I was the one employee of the Special Action Office. So my task was to find people, recruit people, bring together an office that was going to take care of all of these major tasks, get it done quickly. They talked about urgency and how important it was to mobilize all the resources to get this done. And while all this was going on, I was going to visit and make an inspection tour of Vietnam. And I think I did leave somewhere around the 1st of July or something of that sort. Maybe it was the couple of days after that.
Because Bud has left a little bit before you because he comes back.
Yes.
And it's...
Well, we meet in San Clemente.
Right.
But as I recall, I left toward the end of June. So I had maybe 10 days to wind up my affairs at the University of Chicago, to begin recruiting people for the Special Action Office, and to prepare for a trip to Vietnam.
I want to spend some time here working on the different levels of this. And the first one is, I think, an interesting question that people who are not in government service, people who've never gone through this, may not understand. What happens to you personally when you're asked to move yourself, move your family, Chicago to, in your case, Arlington at the drop of a hat? How do you arrange that?
Well, I think you arrange it in different ways. I think that under ordinary circumstances, the first thing people do is they set up some kind of trial balloon to see if you have something in your background, that you had somebody working for you who didn't pay taxes, something of this sort. But that didn't happen with me. So I don't know exactly, why what happened so quickly. Bud said it occasionally happens when you're not sure whether somebody will accept. You do recruitment by ambush, and so they can't really turn you down. But I suspect that they negotiate a few months in advance, and you have some time. This didn't happen, so I don't know how typical it is that these things go on. It was tremendously stressful for me and my family, and certainly for everybody at the program. I mean, I was running a program with several hundred employees and many, many treatment situations. But there were some faculty people there more than willing to take on the grants and to run the program. And I suppose in some ways, although that the people were also pleased that I had been selected. So you lose something, you gain something. But I don't think my family was. I mean, kids were in school. So I don't know how other people react. I just took it as, I suppose what I thought was, in a way, compared to the stresses on the people who are actually serving in Vietnam, who are actually fighting, dying, being wounded, this isn't that much of a burden. And so I felt in some ways, complaints would be inappropriate.
And the next question is about organizing this at a bureaucratic level. I assume that you had to go through some sort of clearance process once the president had appointed you, or was this more or less automatic?
I don't know. I mean, they may have been checking me out even, and Faith would know, because there are FBI people going around asking neighbors exactly when that took place, but maybe they were doing some checking even as I was producing that report, because after all, they want to know who is writing this report. But I just can't recall now. I know they spoke to neighbors and things and did check me out. But I didn't have time to reflect much on it. Now, in terms of getting the program organized, there's something called detailees, where you can actually, because the White House can ask to borrow people from other agencies. And they're very good at that. And so we pulled some good people from OMB. There's a guy named Jim Gregg, who was a young Harvard-trained lawyer who was really a well-organized new bureaucracy. There were other people more than willing to help put it together. Obviously, Bud knew a lot of them, so did other people in the White House. We recruited some other people. We had people detailed from NIMH. So the military sent a couple of people. So we had a little core group and then began to expand. Jeff actually left his position on the White House staff to come over and help.
Jeff Donfeld,
Jeff Donfeld, and so he was invaluable in that.
Because there's another Jeff later on in the story.
Oh, yes, right. This was Jeff Donfeld.
So that you use a lot of detailees to staff this program?
For the first few days, the first couple of weeks, yes.
How did you go about recruiting people to fill out your organization on a more permanent basis?
Well, I will say that this was very unusual, I think, in any White House. I was given carte blanche. There were no litmus tests. You didn't have to be a Republican. You didn't have to agree with the president. And so we recruited almost in a snowball fashion. Jim Gregg knew some people that he believed in. And I recruited Paul Perito, who I had known. He was a congressional staffer. He was a lawyer. Had worked for Claude Pepper's, I think it was the House Committee on Crime. And he had met me because I gave some testimony before Congress on the drug problem and crime. And so I got Paul to come as the general counsel. And he's a Democrat. And we had Jeff and Paul knew some people, and he had some people on his staff. So, people recruited other people. I had some people I knew at NIMH, but the Special Action Office, from its beginning, was given extraordinary power. It was called the Drug Czar's Office. And that extraordinary power had to be limited in some way, and it was limited by this will not last more than 3 years. So I had to tell everybody carefully that if you give up your civil service position, you may not have anything to go back to because this thing is going to end in 3 years. I was committed to that. But people wanted to come anyway. There was something about working in the White House that was, to them had some appeal. And I guess there were some people whose positions didn't like that much anyway.
Rarely hurts anyone to have White House on their CV.
I suppose so. At the time, that didn't occur to me. So that's how it, began to, by accretion. We recruited an executive officer, Ralph Howard. Ralph was a wily guy who really knew the bureaucracy. He was working at OEO. And OEO was one of Lyndon Johnson's favorite vehicles, and Ralph would often be on the other end of a telephone call with the president. I want this done by next week or tomorrow. Ralph knew how to get it done. And so they brought in Ralph Howard as the executive officer. And that was important because there were things that needed to be done, or at least I perceived them needed to be done, with extraordinary alacrity. I mean, they wanted it done tomorrow. And so we were doing it, and we had much more flexibility than the other agencies did. And so we were able to do some things like that. For example, when I got back from Vietnam, I guess it was somewhere around July the 12th or 13th, something like that. We met with the president at San Clemente, and he said, we gave him a report on what we saw, and he said, in the past, great advances in medicine have come about in the context of war. I want you to write a book about what you're finding here. In addition to everything else, I had to write a book. Well, so it's important, and I would have done it anyway, but what he said gave me the imprimatur that I needed to do what I thought needed to be done anyway, which is what happens to these people? How successful was this intervention? And that allowed me to recruit Lee Robbins, who was a professor of sociology in the Department of Psychiatry at Washington University at St. Louis. And she had done some early work on drug addiction. She's just a brilliant lady. Dan Friedman said, call her. I think I knew her from some review committees we were on together. But, and I asked her to do a follow-up study, to do a study of what we did in Vietnam. But in order to do it before it disappeared, we can't wait a year to make the grants. So we sort of got money from various agencies, plus a little bit that we had, and we melded them together and wrote a contract with Lee. And so she was able to do what turns out to be one of the classic studies in all of the history of addiction, the Vietnam follow-up study. And Ralph was critical in pulling those grants together and making it happen. So it's important to know people who know how to move the levers, turn the knobs to get things done in government. And so we had our share of those. Paul recruited somebody named Grassley Cruz from the Federal Reserve. Grassley Cruz was a lawyer, a master legislative draftsman, a writer with phenomenal clarity and brevity, unparalleled. And so he began putting together the actual legislative material to give a statutory base for the Special Action Office. We were created by executive order, which meant that we existed on the White House budget. So there are limits to how long that could go on. We needed a legislative basis, and that meant going to Congress. So somebody had to begin to draft the various pieces of legislation so they could be given to the Congress. And Grassley did that. Grassley subsequently drafted confidentiality regulations that are still in existence, and played a small role in working with methadone, because that was another major initiative. And so we had a number of savvy, competent players who joined us in this effort. I was simply the talking head, if you will.
I'm impressed you got somebody to leave the Fed. They have a much better pay scale.
Paul knew him. I don't know how Paul persuaded him.
I want to ask a couple more questions here, because this is important, and a lot of what comes later, of course, is determined by what comes at the beginning. But this may seem like a trivial point, but I think it's actually an important one. Where were SAUDAP's offices located?
Well, in the very beginning, it was located in one of the townhouses on Lafayette Square. And that was a very pleasant office. It overlooked Lafayette Square, and it had some prestige. But most of the action was going on in I guess it was the new executive office building. That's where our offices were. And so the only purpose for the office in that small townhouse, which was sufficient for, the first few weeks, was for ceremonial purposes. And I didn't believe that much in ceremony. So after a while, I moved my office up to the new executive office building, and that's where we were.
Was it a new exec or old exec, the red brick?
No,
or
it was the red brick. It was the new exec, not the old exec.
The other point is to whom did you report on a day-to-day basis, not just on paper, but on a regular basis within the White House hierarchy?
Well, for some time I reported to Bud Krogh, but as you probably know, I guess it was the 13th of July, he was given other tasks, and so he could not, on a regular basis, confer with us. So, in a way, we were sort of using our best judgment. I mean, we'd talk to Bud from time to time, but I suspect that at some point, Jeff Shepard might have played a role. There were a couple of other people, but it was really not that clear. Until Bud left, he was our guy, but he didn't have that much time.
And Bud, of course, doesn't formally leave until early 73, late 72, early
That's
73.
Right.
So for a long time, you were almost quasi-autonomous.
Yes.
And you did get your separate legislative base, so you weren't on the...
Well, Paul negotiated very effectively. I mean, we spent so much of our time in congressional hearings. Paul says we testified before Congress 100 times in the first 18 months. Because our jurisdiction spanned, at least a dozen agencies. We had talked in front of the VA, in front of government org. We went over and over, and everybody, and in a sense, we were, the idea of this extraordinary power was at the expense of some of the committees and OMB. So on the one hand, you get extraordinary power, but you instantly make lots of enemies because you've essentially usurped, if you will, some of their prerogatives. Now, but Paul negotiated this, and we had some help. I mean, he was a Democrat, he knew people, but there was virtually no opposition, very little opposition to the idea of this new thrust, because Nixon's original war on drugs was a rebalancing of what was going on before that, which was almost an emphasis on law enforcement and arresting people. So this was the first time in the history of the country where more resources were going into treatment and research and prevention than were going into law enforcement. And, there were very few people who opposed that. And at the end, it passed unanimously. And the president, as Bud told you, the president said, I rarely get to sign a bill like this. And so, it was very successful, and we did get the legislation. But it took almost a year, I think, until the following March. And during that time, it left you a little bit uncertain as to where you could push, because everybody in any of the bureaucracies had their own relationships with different people in Congress. And although you might want to get some things done, you had to do it very, very gingerly. You had the authority, but not necessarily was it wise to push too hard, because that might give rise to opposition to the legislative base in the Congress. So we were, from June until the following March, we were sort of a limbo, not limbo, but we did not really have a firm budget or legislative base.
A couple more points on this. You mentioned earlier, well, actually, let me ask you a different question. We'll come back to the other one. What was your relationship with one particular agency, BNDD?
BNDD was not problematic from our perspective because, it was clear that the president did not want this office to actually dictate to BNDD. Although Congress insisted that they wanted one person they could hold accountable, so there was an assistant director of the Office for Law Enforcement. But largely it was a coordinating kind of thing. I didn't feel I had the expertise, or anybody in the organization had the expertise to second guess what they were doing. The one thing we were able to, I think that we probably, they were not great fans of you could say the regularization of methadone. They had opposed that. And so actually the first thing we did very early on was, this is going to be part of what we do. We thought that was probably enough of a sacrifice they were making from their interest perspective. And so largely they were pretty much on their own. I don't think we controlled their budget even. So we didn't have the same span of responsibility or authority over BNDD. We did have one thing, yes. One of the things BNDD was prone to do through the 1970s was they had control over all of the Schedule I drugs. These were drugs without medical uses. But that didn't mean they didn't have uses. They just weren't approved medical uses. And that included things like cannabis, hallucinogens, things of that sort. But it might even include things like LAM, alpha-acetylmethadol. It's a long-acting opiate that we had done some investigative work on in Chicago even. And they were reluctant to allow researchers to get any. And they were complaining bitterly that they would try to get a grant and this was worth researching, but they couldn't get any of the material. And on that one, I did suggest to them that they move with a little bit more rapidity, and to the extent, as long as I was there, they were cooperative, and people got what they needed. This was not the threat to the body politic. One researcher doing some work on some rats, so they did give more attention to that. Other than that, I don't recall anything. When Miles Ambrose took a role in working on a broader coordination of law enforcement. Miles was the commissioner of customs at the time and was given a role. Miles and I thought, worked reasonably well together. And we talked about what the priorities ought to be.
You've mentioned a few times the sense that there was a feeling that you had, that some of your peers had, that the White House apparently shared, that there needed to be a national strategy.
Yes.
Was there from the beginning a sense that national meant federal, or did you see this as being a coordination of existing agencies at the federal and state level?
No, national meant national. The idea that it had to be federal was, I think, mine. The fact is that we were in tremendous turmoil at the time. That, at the time we were trying to produce this strategy, the idea that you could get 50 states and localities to agree that this ought to be the strategy seemed to be a reach. I mean, we could really talk realistically about this is what the federal government will try to do. But you had tremendous disparities. I mean, Governor Rockefeller was putting in, his more or less draconian laws. other people were doing other things. So you had the notion that you can put together a federal strategy, but the idea of a national strategy where you can get the states and localities to come together and agree on exactly what our priorities ought to be and how we ought to approach this thing was something for a later time. And so although it's called the national strategy and that's what I was supposed to do, I knew I couldn't do it. Within that time frame, it couldn't be done. And so the first national strategy was called the federal strategy. And I take responsibility for that.
One last point here, and this is kind of a broader point. It seems like what really captured the federal government's attention when it came to treatment was not the prevalence or the incidence of addiction in the civilian population in the United States, but it was this acute problem of Vietnam veterans, that this is what really, catalyzed action. Is that fair, or?
Well, you're kind of asking me to look into the minds of people that I never had this discussion with. The president, John Ehrlichman, Haldeman, the real decision makers, the deciders, as it's now said. And it's clear that they got our report, that Krogh and Donfeld were pushing for a broadened emphasis on treatment, and that clearly they thought that methadone could have an impact on addiction and on crime, and that was a commitment the president had made. I don't think they had the same enthusiasm that I had for expanding research, or even at looking at outcomes the way I wanted to. But I think it would have happened anyway. It might have happened 3 or 4 months later, maybe not with as much, public attention, maybe not a big presidential initiative. So you could say that I think fair to say that the addiction among Vietnam troops was a catalyst, a precipitating factor that determined the time and maybe even the scope and the breadth of the initiative. But there would have been an initiative. It might have been, just the 50 million or the 100 million, and not the 300 million that we, ultimately allocated to this. So I think something would have happened. It might have, as I said, not been of the same magnitude.
It also strikes me that we were talking earlier about the stereotypical addict, and how you'd found in your own work that this was not a picture that really comported with reality. It does strike me that soldiers, almost by definition, are not in anybody's, stereotype, or were not at that point in anybody's portrait of the stereotype. Was there a sense that, if it could be shown that addiction was a medical and not a moral failing, that this would be?
Well, I think that the president, I'm certain because he said things like this, was aware, as most of us were, that when you start to say that 20 or 30% of the troops are addicted to heroin, you're essentially stigmatizing everybody who's coming back in terms of getting jobs, in terms of whether people will trust them, in terms of a variety of things. And so, given the stereotypes available, it was important to demonstrate either that that number was probably not realistic, or that people recover. Now, I knew they recovered because I saw them all the time in Illinois. I mean, people that I would trust with my life, I had treated a year before. So, this was not anything new to me. But it was important, if our treatment has any value and people can recover, it's important that the notion of recovery to normality, to trustworthiness, become part of the way we think about things. Because without going deeply into the past history of what we did with addicts, particularly opiate addicts, the people were saying these are doomed souls, once an addict, always an addict, and everybody used things like that to justify some of the draconian penalties we used. I mean, there were places where if you were possession of an opiate, you would get 10 years in prison. Now, in order to justify that, you had to think that anybody who uses gets addicted, and anybody gets addicted, they're lost souls, never useful. That was wrong, inaccurate, and costly in terms of making it possible for people to recover. If everybody thinks that once you're an addict, you're forever an addict, how do you expect to be able to get a job, and how do you expect to do all the things we expect them to do? So we had to change the stereotype. We had to say recovery is possible, and particularly we wanted that to be known about the people who were serving in Vietnam. And we did everything we could for that.
One thing, because I wanted to close this off, and because we're about to take you to Vietnam again, what were the actual numbers of troops who were coming back with addiction?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, because there are two sets of numbers that sometimes cause confusion. The numbers I got when I was over there, and I was over there, I guess it was starting roughly the beginning of July. They were dropping rapidly from 10%. By the time I was ready to leave and report to the president, they were down to about 5% positives. Now, keep in mind, the 5% positives were made up of every single soul that wanted to get on an airplane. I think they might have been testing brigadier generals, but I'm not sure. I know they were testing colonels, and they were testing everybody. So depending on who was leaving that day, if it was mostly officers, mostly Air Corps, mostly Navy, you would get less. If it was mostly Army enlisted men, you'd get more. So there was a fluctuation that had to do with the randomness of who was being discharged on that day.
So there were different populations within the...
Oh, yeah. Well, what we found within a matter of 4 months or so was that there was virtually no heroin use among the military personnel above the level of sergeant. Just almost didn't happen. So you didn't see it among the second lieutenants, first lieutenants, captains, majors. It just didn't happen. It was much less among the Navy people, much less among the Army people. It was predominantly a problem of Army enlisted men, because they were where the heroin was. And in that group, what Lee Robbins found, because she selected a group who left in September, that 40% of those Army enlisted men, this is, again, below the level of sergeant and down, 40% had tried opiates while in Vietnam. So trying it was common. 20% of them, roughly, said at some point they had been hooked. So if you look at what the congressman said, 15 to 20, they weren't that far off. Their problem was to extrapolate that to every single person there rather than say among Army enlisted men. Now, so the two are compatible. What we saw was everybody. What she studied was the group with the highest levels of addiction, and she studied that not because we weren't interested in the other people, but because when we wrote that contract, we just didn't have the money to launch a bigger study. We were on the White House budget trying to grab money from various agencies to make Lee Robbins' study possible, so she could begin it with the people who left in September.
And was this study longitudinal or cross-sectional?
She got a sample of men leaving in September. She oversampled those who are opiate positive. She got a sample of, and obviously she had people who were opiate negative. And she also got a sample of people who were serving but not in Vietnam, and I believe she got a comparable sample of people not in the military from the Selective Service Registries. It was a beautifully done study.
This is a huge study at this point.
It was large, but it also required a lot of cooperation. It required the cooperation of local selective service boards, and all of which required that commitment that said, from the president, you will write a book. And I said, that is a directive. And so every time people said, well, we don't want to give you that data, or you can't get that, or it's too hard, I had to make a phone call.
So President Nixon says you will write a book, and this becomes, at the working level. This
became the key that opened the doors to allow Lee Robbins to do that study. I mean, I think there were people who did not want to find, who were afraid of what they would find. And I said, well, I can understand their anxiety, but we need to know. Truth may hurt, but it'll be the truth. And so that's what we did.
But that is a classic story, and this is a good reminder of what happens when presidents say something. It may not turn out to be what they were expecting.
Well, I think it turned out to be surprisingly positive, in that of all of those addicted, instead of 100% relapsing, there are only 5% of those who were addicted in Vietnam who continued to be addicted in the United States in that first year back. Nobody believed that. There were people who accused Lee Robbins of spinning the data, and she spent a lot of her professional activity defending her integrity. And it's one of the reasons I've never, wanted to be a co-author, although I helped design it in some ways and made it happen. I did not want to participate in the writing because that might have given people even more ammunition to say the White House was spinning this.
Let's talk then about your inspection tour of Vietnam.
Well, what is there to say? I went and I was amazed to see how extensive they were. They had to set up these detox facilities. They had to set up the urine testing facilities. They didn't really believe in the frat machine, by the way. So what they did, and they didn't want to hold anybody accountable for a positive opiate unless they confirmed it. So they set up banks of gas chromatography machines and brought trained technicians in trained at Walter Reed and other places. So if anybody came up with a positive, it had to be confirmed with gas chromatography.
So they were using the frat machines as just an initial screening?
They were the initial screens. Now, were there people who got through the screen that shouldn't have? I don't know. Were there people who were positive, but the gas chromatograph was not as, perhaps didn't pick it up or wasn't as accurate? Don't know that either. But we did send some experts of gas chromatography over to inspect, who had more technological background than I did, to make sure that that was not the case. And they didn't come back with any complaints about the technology. So we think that it was probably accurate. It was really, when I think of it, I think the civilians could have never done that. I mean, they had that plumbing and a variety of things that are far beyond. And when I think of it, and I have to say that it was astounding to me that they were able to accomplish all of that from May the 30th to June the 17th. They even had to do things with the electrical current, because the frat machine and the gas chromatography equipment required better, steadier electrical current than they were able to get at those Army bases. So they organized all of that in under 3 weeks. Really quite astounding, remarkable. And I was sick for a couple of days in Vietnam. I don't know what I had, but it persisted for the next 3 months. I got some kind of virus, I think. And I met with various military people, Creighton Abrams, things of this sort. And they were kind of sympathetic to change this into something more medical than dishonorable discharge. Nobody complained. I mean, there were some initial complaints from some of the military. This was stateside when I met with them about wanting to get these people out of their outfits. I can understand that. But the fact is that we don't want them shipped home as soon as you detect them. That's exactly what we don't want. We want them to not be dependent when they left. So there were little squeaks here and there, but I think things got ironed out. I did have to tell the press that I didn't want the data released on a daily basis. And I told them why. I guess they thought that was their prerogative to see the data coming out of the machines. But the fact is that you could get these wildly fluctuating things depending on who came. So one guy would report 8%, another guy would report 3%, and somebody else would report 9%. They were all true. But what counts is what was the average for the week, because they almost never tell you the context of how this is an issue of the mix of who's coming for the testing. There were some other things as well. There were obviously people try to beat a system. There were people who were buying urine or switching urine, but they made allowances for all of that. I don't think a lot of that happened. What else? There were some interesting adventures that I don't have a clear recollection of because I had a fever. But apparently we were flying to Cam Ranh Bay and we lost an engine over Viet Cong territory. But
it's probably a very good time to have a fever.
Yeah, well, those things happen. I don't have a good, clear recollection of. We met with people at the embassy, things of this sort. All in all, I'm not really well, I guess it was useful for me to see what they had accomplished and to actually get the data and show this is the data. And I think the president trusted me to get it. He had reason, as Bud Krogh indicated to you probably, that he had some reason to be a little skeptical about the reports he was getting from the military. Because up until the time of the Murphy and Steele report, the military was saying we only had 100 addicts. That's it. And it just didn't make sense because Bud's visit has said that heroin is just flowing freely.
How did things proceed after the summer of 1971? What becomes your big initiatives? You're supporting research, you're supporting clinics. How do you start to work through the rest of 71 and 72?
Well, the list of what we had to achieve was so long that, it began to, it was, clearly not achievable within the time frame that we had. But some of the things we wanted to do was demonstrate that you could get treatment up, that you could show that people were getting into treatment. The problem was, within the bureaucracy, some of the things that they do take months and months and months. If you make an application for a grant, for example, it then has to go out for review, and so it's 6 months often before it's even reviewed, and another 6 or 9 months before the money actually flows down, and then maybe people take another 3 or 4 months before they open first treatment. And basically, the problem with some of what was being done in the form in which the government supported treatment was in the form of grants for the most part. Now, a grant is technically a gift. So if you don't do anything with a gift, that's okay. And we've seen this subsequently, that if you give somebody money sufficient to treat 100 people and they only treat 10, well, what can you do about it? It's a gift. So based on my experience in Illinois, we changed things around with the help of OEO. We developed sort of might call it a quasi-contract. It was, again, another hybrid sort of a contract gift. It said, this is enough, to treat X number of people. This is, we developed a new if you will, a new terminology. This is enough for this kind of slot. And that means you keep it filled. And we're going to come back and we're going to measure what you kept filled. And whether you get any more will be a function of whether you do it. Now, the other thing is that when you, under the old system, when you put in grants, you could have a 4 or 5-fold factor in how much each episode of treatment was going to cost, because that was up to the investigator or the applicant. And we tried to say, look, we know what it costs. And, we're going to accept people willing to take these contracts, these quasi-contracts. But if you're 3 times higher, if Minnesota is 3 times higher than Baltimore, then we'll fund Baltimore first. We had to introduce some competition so that people would say, I think that we may not get any if we ask for that much.
How did recipients respond to this?
Some were happy that the money was available. And some were a little annoyed that they wouldn't have as much as they were used to spending. We were also concerned about how much disappeared on the way down to the treatment level. And there's lots of bureaucratic siphoning off. And we tried to deal with that as well.
By the recipients themselves, or? No,
it's the money often went to a city or a state, and somehow it never got down to where it never met the road. It never produced anything. So we worked on those issues. A lot of our time was spent in working through how can you use a drug like methadone, which, for a non-tolerant individual, the doses used in methadone treatment programs could be lethal. So if you were treating somebody and he sold that dose of methadone meant for him to somebody else, he could kill them. So how can you build a system that minimizes that diversion, and make certain that people get a certain amount of treatment and support it in a reasonable way? And we had already had some experience because people had been using methadone, I guess, since about 1966, when it began to, maybe 67, it began to be used in various places. We had used it 68, 69, and 70. And we knew that there were some, you might call them outliers, mavericks, but there were physicians who were prescribing in ways which seemed to be both risky for the patients and risky for the public. And just recommendations did not seem to be sufficient to bring that under control. So we needed a way to say, yes, we're going to have more treatment, but it's going to be constrained in ways that will minimize the likelihood of bad outcomes for the patients being treated and for the public. Now that meant, in some ways, actually interfering with the practice of medicine. And it was, no apologies. And so, working with Peter Hutt at the Food and Drug Administration, we crafted something called a hybrid IND drug approval. So yes, we approved it for this use, but it was still an IND in terms of we can constrain the way you use it.
IND is?
Investigational New Drug. So usually when a drug is approved, it has a label. You can read the label, but the doctor is then free to use the drug using his or her best judgment, clinical judgment, with respect to dose, with respect to frequency. So all of that's left to clinical judgment. There is no enforcement mechanism, or it's rare. Even when you think the drug has some risks, the best you can do is what's called a black box warning. You put it in big, bold letters. This drug could cause this or that or the other thing. So the clinician is aware of that, makes the patient aware of that, presumably, but still uses it according to his or her best judgment. We didn't think that was sufficient. At the time, given the shortage of treatment, methadone had considerable street value. And so physicians willing to prescribe, and there were such, they would basically, the amount that you would get was proportional to the amount that you were willing to pay. So we created, Peter Hutt did, this hybrid IND approval that said, under these circumstances, you can run a methadone program. And we also specified, and this was the difficulty, how can you support something if you don't know the amount of treatment you're supporting? What is a unit of treatment? And so we defined a unit of treatment within those regulations, and that allowed us to go out with these hybrid contracts and say, you want to treat 150 people? This is how much money we'll give you. Go to it. And that took a lot of time, a lot of negotiation. And at the same time, we were funding research. We were thinking about the upcoming national strategy. We were doing work on prevention. We had a variety of things in that respect. And we did all of this, I guess, between testimony before Congress 100 times. And people were always asking us about what's the latest data from Vietnam, what's the latest data from this and that. So I guess what were some of the other, oh yes, we launched some other studies. We were interested in finding another, to see whether we could further develop something now called LAM. It's a long-acting methadone, because then there would be no diversion. You could take it 3 times a week, and there'd be nothing that would cause anybody to have an overdose death. And so that had to be structured, and we had to work on that. We tried to further develop naltrexone, which had not yet been approved. As a matter of fact, it didn't get approved for another 10 years, but that's not because we didn't launch the initial studies.
Now, you mentioned that naltrexone these days is mainly used for alcohol.
Yeah, that was an interesting discovery that came about somewhere, I think, in the early 1990s. They found that animals given naltrexone don't self-administer alcohol. Then they tried it with people, and it also reduced it. So its approval for the use of alcoholism was interesting, and it's most widely used now for alcoholism.
What I'm wondering is, you're talking to Congress, you're talking to the public, you're talking to the bureaucratic community, the broader public community that's involved with all this. As your programs begin to mature, do people express skepticism about methadone? Do they call for a harsher law and order? Because obviously there's a turn in 1973 toward a more repressive system.
I'm not sure how that came about. I think that, and this comes to me from Bud. He said that when he and the president, I guess it was Miles Ambrose, were flying over the Bronx, the president said, look, we know that treatment is important, but what those people down there want is for us to lock all the addicts up, to lock up the pushers. They just want it off the streets. And so, I think that there's a place for responding to that concern, and there still is. Drugs being sold on street corners and things of this sort. And there's also a place for treating those who want treatment. So I think that once the crisis of demonstrating that all of our veterans aren't addicted had passed, and we had funded treatment. I mean, 2/3 of the federal budget was now going to treatment, research, prevention, as compared to law enforcement. The president was able to say, now we have to return to the other issues, because he has a constituency as well. And by that time, Rockefeller had already sort of, if you said, moved further to the right. Now, Rockefeller, interesting, concluded at that point, treatment doesn't work. Well, the treatment he selected and spent a lot of money on was not working, because what he selected was civil commitment. He spent a lot of money on bricks and mortar, a lot of money pushing people into treatment situations that weren't therapeutic and that didn't really work. Now, he did support methadone as well, but it's clear that the major thrust of treatment was a disappointment to him. And so he came up with the Rockefeller laws with minimum mandatories. And minimum mandatory penalties for drug users was not unique or did not occur for the first time. Actually, in 1951 and 1956, there were minimum mandatories for narcotics violations. But they had been, I think, largely done away with under the Controlled Substances Act. And so the president decided that we ought to go back to minimum mandatories. Now, my concern at that time was looking at the overall resources, because the president was also concerned with deficits. I was also concerned with deficits. And, maybe it wasn't my place to be, but I did feel that everything we were spending was taken from somebody who didn't part with it willingly. They were taxes, and that you needed to be prudent about how you spent things. And so if you began with minimum mandatories for simple possession or other things, it doesn't take, higher level calculus to figure out that the size of the prison population would increase. And prisons cost much more than anything we do on the treatment side, even residential programs. And as long as if you're doing that, you're making a commitment that goes on for another decade that only increases. And so I was sort of saying, maybe you should wait on this a little bit, because I was not convinced that the people who they were arresting are necessarily deterred by the size of the penalty. They're deterred by the likelihood of the penalty. That was just from reading, I'm not an expert on criminal justice, but everything I read says it's probability of the consequence, not the severity of the consequence, that necessarily changes the behavior. So I wrote a long memo. I think Grassley drafted it. And we said, don't do this yet. And with that came my end of my tenure at the White House. And so I left in June of 1973.
I wanted to ask you, and this seems the appropriate time, you showed me a document earlier, and in it you discuss a typology of critics. There's two kinds of critics.
Oh yeah. Well, we took a lot of criticism. Some of it justified. We certainly didn't do everything the way it could have been done. But and there are people who criticize constructively. You didn't do this, you didn't do that. They're not necessarily mean-spirited, but they're saying you ought to do this. Some of it was, what are you going to do about jobs for addicts? Well, we don't control the economy. We're just dealing with drug addiction. What are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? And there are others who clearly had political motives. They just didn't like the president, and they used any means to attack. And those people didn't really need to find anything wrong. They would make up things, or they would exaggerate things. They would take an occasional extreme example and portray it as the typical. And so, that was the other kind of critic that was perhaps more difficult to deal with because we don't control the media. And it makes for a better story when you can sort of take something out of context and say we made this kind of stupid mistake. So, if we had had a longer lifespan, perhaps under less divisive political circumstances, I mean, this was, as you recall, our last 6 months of working at the White House was in some ways colored by the growing concern with Watergate. And so anything that people could, aim at the White House, probably they would.
How did that affect you on a day-to-day basis?
Well, it, in some ways, had very little effect, technically, but it was demoralizing. In April, John Ehrlichman was forced to resign. I don't think I knew at that time Bud Krog's involvement, but clearly we felt that, the leadership was distracted. And, people you respect when they're in difficulty, it has an effect. And I certainly felt that people, at least in the area of drug abuse, had made remarkable commitments to things that I had devoted myself to research, to treatment, to prevention, things of that sort. And so to see them leave under those circumstances was demoralizing. And it was also demoralizing for the staff. The other thing that I think was perhaps equally demoralizing was the decision, and maybe it's a good one, that we needed new blood after the election. So I think sometime, in that spring, decision came down from the White House that we're going to ask for resignations. Now, people have been working 18 and 19 hours a day for me. I wasn't going to push them out. It was just not something that I could do. And I would rather leave than have to tell people who'd worked that hard that you have to leave. Not because you didn't do what you were supposed to do, but because somebody, some other place, thinks that you should leave. So, those two things taken together, had some impact. So I did not wish I could have left differently, but they were the terms. They were the times I lived in.
A little bit after you leave, I want to ask about this because it's an important point about what had happened earlier. President Nixon makes a comment that he thinks that America is turning the corner. We were talking about that off camera a little bit. What did that mean? What did the media think or said that they thought it mean? And what is the distinction between incidence and prevalence?
Well, I guess I take part responsibility for the president making that statement. He was so smart that he grasped things that some of his staff didn't. I mean, he knew the difference between incidence and prevalence. Incidence meaning the number of new cases, and prevalence meaning the total number of existing cases. We were gathering data, as we should, about what's happening, what are the trends. And everything we saw indicated to us that the number of new cases had reached a peak by roughly 72, 71, 72. It had reached a crisis. And that we were seeing in 73 fewer new cases. Now, when you have something that's long-lasting, let's say like heroin, it doesn't mean that prevalence will disappear. I mean, you can get a reduction in the number of people with the disorder only if they die or get cured. But some do leave the system because they've recovered, and some do die. So if you have fewer new cases, it means that over time, it will not be growing as rapidly, so that the prevalence will not be growing at the rate it was growing. And if you're a public health person and you're looking at something like flu or some other disorder, and the number of new cases goes down, it means that the epidemic has crested, it's peaked, and that with some good fortune, the prevalence will go down. Now, I think I told the president that at some point, that this is what we're looking at. So it may mean that, that the number of new cases is going down, the prevalence will stabilize, and that if we're effective in treating people, the number of chronic users, the prevalence will go down. And I think that sometime later in the, maybe it was September after my resignation and some Bob DuPont took on, he had a little conference and he spoke in those terms. So that's turning the corner. And I think what he meant was exactly what I just said. Not that the crisis, not that the problem is over, but it's not going to keep getting worse as it has for the previous 4 or 5 years, because he took office almost as this thing was further going up and up. We had been in almost an 8-year crescendo of more and more new cases. I think that people interpret that in 2 different ways. There was consternation among the people who were getting money on the treatment and prevention side, that this meant he would turn off all the money. And I think that, people who expected that to mean that, drug addiction was finished, it was all over, took it to mean he was declaring premature victory. And he didn't mean either of those things. But he thought that maybe just a little bit of, better news would be welcome. And, it was just too bad that nobody wanted to see it for what he meant it to be. And frankly, I guess there are times when being smarter than everybody else has its price. And he understood incidence and prevalence, and he understood it without notes. Really quite remarkable.
I want to ask for your recollections of some of the White House staff members that you worked with. Some of them are still with us, some of them aren't. But John Ehrlichman has come up a few times. What were your relations with him like?
They were always pleasant. John had a wry sense of humor, very smart, and my few interactions with him were always cordial, pleasant. That's all I can tell you.
Yeah.
Didn't see him that often.
Bud?
Bud Krogh was an amazing man. Bud exudes competence, leadership. Somebody, you can trust, understood things, got things done. I always found it remarkable that he was younger than I was, and he knew all these things, did all these things. And a man I trusted, and I always felt that, and still do, that there but for the grace of God go I. I think that, as I said to him, I don't know that I would have done anything differently than you did. And I spoke to him about that on various times, that the context in which he was behaving was one in which he knew well. He was told he was dealing with national security. He had been there watching people fighting. Bud had been in the Navy himself. So he understood this issue. And so it's, a man I admire.
Walter Minnick.
Walter was very smart. I think if I'm not mistaken, he graduated summa cum laude from Harvard. Not easy to do. And Walter was, very quick, very sharp, and we worked together, I think, toward the end of my tenure on finding a new way to produce medicinal opiates without the risk of diversion of opium. And I think that was successful. Always liked Walter and still talk to him. smart, decent, honorable man.
I wanted to ask you about this earlier, but we got caught up with other things. What was your neighborhood like in the south side of Chicago? You had some interesting neighbors.
Well, the south side of Chicago, we lived in something called the Jackson Park Highlands, and they were, generally speaking, large houses going for far less than they were worth because it was a kind of an ethnically mixed neighborhood. Not far from some apartments of lower income people, but there were faculty members. I mean, Arthur Laffer, who was an economist with George Shultz, lived across the street. We had other University of Chicago faculty living down the street. There were some wealthy people still living across the street. But walking through the neighborhood could be risky. Oh, Jesse Jackson lived, I think, a block down on our side of the street. But it was risky in the sense that even though our babysitter lived only halfway down the block, when I had to take her home late at night, we got in the car and I drove her to her door and watched her in. There were some... It was a tough time in 1968, 69, and 70 on the south side of Chicago. I should mention that 2 streets away, one of the houses, which had been occupied by a well-known musician, had been sort of abandoned, and we were able to get it at a reasonable price, and we used it for one of our therapeutic communities.
Who was it?
I think, Bo Diddley. And so his house became one of the houses. It backed onto the house of a faculty member. He lived on one street, they lived on the other in the 2 backyards, but it's a large house, and we began one of the therapeutic communities there. And we kept it there for about a year.
How did the faculty member react?
He was very, he got to know them and was reasonably pleased in a way. They were good neighbors.
Looking back on it, how do you see SAUDAP as fitting into the broader sweep?
How do I see what?
SAUDAP as fitting into the broader sweep of American anti-drug politics?
Well, I think that you can probably overdo expectations that something as divisive as how we will deal with drugs in a society can be resolved by some special office with a drug czar. I mean, you can more rationally allocate resources. You can articulate goals, and if you can, perhaps rein in spending that is not productive. But beyond that, there are issues that go far beyond anything that government can do. And so what that first agency did was perhaps create a model for how you coordinate something that is that touches on so many aspects of a society that you need coordination across agencies, and that can't be done by just 1 or 2 staff people in the White House or OMB. And apparently they continue to have something called, a drug office. And it has had good times and bad times in terms of its influence, in terms of, how effective it's been. But it's 40 years later. They still have somebody called a drug czar. So I suppose it was a model. And, in some ways, they continue to recreate this idea of a czar's office to coordinate things across agencies. They have an energy czar and a this czar, and that czar. Given the diversity of government agencies and their, they each have their own mission, but their missions overlap. Something in the executive office has to be able to coordinate them, to get them work together, to reduce the redundancy and the waste. And I guess it's a useful model. Whether we demonstrated that it could do something useful is for the historians to say. But I think that it played its role in showing that from time to time you need that. Whether you always need that is another question, but apparently the decision is, well, we'll let it go.